July 11, 1302. Just outside the walls of a small Flemish town called Kortrijk, the ground trembled beneath the hooves of thousands of French knights. It was the greatest army France had ever assembled, a glittering sea of steel and banners, where sunlight danced off polished armor and golden spurs. To the French, this wasn't just a battle. It was a royal punishment. They were here to crush a rebellion of dirty peasants, as they called them, weavers, butchers, and farmers who dared defy the most powerful kingdom in Europe. But by the end of that day, the very symbol of French nobility, those same golden spurs, would hang in a Flemish church as trophies, ripped from the corpses of fallen knights. The flower of French chivalry would lie broken in the mud, destroyed not by nobles or professional soldiers, but by common craftsmen wielding homemade weapons. This is the story of how medieval Europe's untouchable warrior class learned, the hard way, that courage, discipline, and a few well-dug ditches could shatter centuries of aristocratic dominance. The roots of this battle go back just 2 months earlier, to one of the most shocking massacres in medieval Europe. May 18, 1302. Bruges. The bells of dawn prayers began to ring. French soldiers stationed in the city were still half asleep when a mob of furious Flemish rebels stormed through the streets, led by a man named Peter de Koninck. Their plan was brutally simple: find every Frenchman in Bruges and kill him. To tell friend from foe, they used a deadly linguistic test. Each man was ordered to say a simple Flemish phrase, schild en vriend, shield and friend. Those who couldn't pronounce it right, whose tongues stumbled on the guttural Flemish sounds, were cut down on the spot. By sunrise, more than 2,000 French soldiers and sympathizers lay dead. The streets ran red. This became known as the Matins of Bruges, a massacre that sent shockwaves through Europe. And when King Philip IV of France heard what had happened, he swore vengeance. He promised to wipe the Flemish people from the map, city by city, family by family. What Philip assembled in response wasn't just an army. It was a statement of power. Led by Count Robert II of Artois, the French force was the most elite and expensive war machine of its age, 2,500 mounted knights and squires, the cream of France's nobility. Dukes, counts, barons, and their heirs, men who'd been trained for war since childhood. Their armor was worth more than a craftsman would earn in a lifetime. Their war horses, massive destriers bred for centuries, were living weapons in their own right. Supporting them were 5,500 infantrymen, including the feared Genoese crossbowmen, renowned as Europe's deadliest missile troops. For 300 years, French knights had dominated the battlefield. They'd crushed rebellions, conquered kingdoms, and scattered peasant uprisings with ease. So when they rode north to punish the Flemish, they weren't expecting a battle. They were expecting an execution. The army that rose to meet them couldn't have looked more different. Led by William of Jülich and Guy of Nemours, the Flemish force was made up almost entirely of urban militia, ordinary citizens, members of trade guilds from cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres. Weavers, butchers, carpenters, tanners, men who worked with their hands and had the calluses to prove it. They had no cavalry, no noble blood, no fine armor. Many wore nothing more than padded leather or their own work aprons into battle. But what they lacked in equipment, they made up for in sheer desperation. They weren't fighting for glory or a king's ambition. They were fighting for survival, for their homes, their families, their very way of life. They knew that if they lost, their people would be exterminated. There was nowhere to run. This was their land, and they would stand or die on it. The Flemish carried a weapon few outside Flanders had ever seen, the goedendag, which literally means good day. It was a cruel, simple thing, a 5-foot wooden staff tipped with an iron spike. Part club, part spear. Cheap, brutal, and devastating in the hands of a strong man. A single blow could crush a knight's helmet or pierce through mail. But what made the goedendag truly revolutionary wasn't its design, it was what it represented. This was a peasant's weapon. It didn't require years of training or noble birth. Any man with muscle and anger could use it to kill a knight who'd spent his life mastering swordplay and horsemanship. It was the weapon of equality, crude, defiant, and terrifyingly effective. When the Flemish chose their battlefield, they did so with genius-level cunning. They took position on flat ground near Kortrijk, between the Lys River and a small stream called the Groning. But they didn't just wait for the French to arrive. They reshaped the terrain overnight. Working through the darkness of July 10th, they dug dozens of hidden ditches and trenches, invisible from a distance, covered with brush and grass. Perfect traps for charging cavalry. The rivers and marshes on both flanks made flanking impossible. The only way to attack was head-on, straight into the killing ground. At dawn, the Flemish formed up in tight ranks, a wall of pikes and goedendags, their city guild banners fluttering above them. They weren't an army in the traditional sense. They were a wall of human defiance, citizens ready to fight for their homes. When Count Robert of Artois arrived and saw the Flemish formation, he laughed. No cavalry? No knights? To him, this wasn't an army, it was a mob waiting to die. Some French commanders suggested using their crossbowmen to weaken the enemy first, but Robert refused. To him, that would be dishonorable. He reportedly said, "Should we let merchants' blood stain our swords when we could simply ride them down like wheat?" So the knights prepared to charge. They saw not enemies, but disobedient commoners who needed to be crushed under hooves and lances. They believed they were about to restore the natural order of the world. Noon, July 11, 1302. The sun blazed over the fields near Kortrijk. On one side, 9,000 Flemish militiamen standing shoulder to shoulder, silent and steady. On the other, 2,500 of France's most elite knights, restless on their war horses, their armor glinting like mirrors. Then came the order, charge. The sound was like thunder rolling across the earth. Thousands of hooves pounded the ground as the French cavalry began their attack, a moving wall of steel and muscle, banners snapping in the wind, lances lowered for the kill. To any observer, the outcome seemed inevitable. For 3 centuries, no peasant army had ever stood its ground against a mounted knightly charge. But this time, things would be different. The first line of knights thundered across the open plain, shouting war cries and expecting the Flemish to break and run. But the militia didn't move. Not one man. They waited perfectly still until the knights were almost upon them. And then disaster struck. The front ranks of charging cavalry suddenly vanished into the earth, horses screaming as their legs snapped in the hidden ditches. Knights were catapulted headfirst into the mud, their heavy armor turning them into helpless, flailing targets. The second wave, unable to stop in time, crashed directly into the wreckage of the first. And then the third slammed into the second. In less than a minute, the proud French cavalry charge had turned into a chaotic pile of men, horses, and twisted armor trapped, drowning, and screaming in the Flanders mud. That's when the Flemish line surged forward. It wasn't an elegant advance, it was a wave of rage. Men who'd spent their lives at looms, anvils, and butcher tables fell upon the trapped knights with goedendags and pikes. What followed wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The sound was deafening, iron clubs smashing against helmets, armor buckling under blows, the air filled with grunts, screams, and the metallic rhythm of destruction. Chroniclers later wrote that it sounded like 1,000 blacksmiths hammering at once. Knights who'd never known fear suddenly found themselves face to face with it. Some begged for mercy, in French, in Latin, in desperate broken Flemish. But few were spared. The weavers of Ghent and the butchers of Bruges had no pity for the men who'd treated their people as animals. A few knights managed to avoid the ditches and continued the charge, but what they met next was even worse. The Flemish had formed tight phalanxes of long pikes, 12 to 18 feet in length, each one a wall of sharpened death. The knights tried to press through, but horses refused to impale themselves on the spikes. They reared, threw their riders, and turned the charge into chaos. On foot, the knights were slow and disoriented, their armor weighing up to 60 pounds. They swung swords meant for horseback fighting, while the Flemish moved like a single machine. When one militiaman fell, another stepped into his place. This wasn't personal dueling. It was industrial warfare, teamwork over individual glory. And it worked. One by one, France's elite fell to farmers and craftsmen. In the middle of the slaughter, Count Robert II of Artois, the French commander, gathered what remained of his household knights and made a desperate push toward the Flemish center. For a moment, it looked like he might break through. His sword cut down several militiamen as he forced his way into the front ranks. But then, a Bruges butcher named Willem van Sefting, a man whose name would echo in Flemish legend, struck him squarely with a goedendag. The blow crushed Robert's helmet and threw him to the ground. He was swarmed instantly, beaten to death by the same men he'd come to annihilate. Around him fell dozens of France's highest nobles, including Jacques de Chatillon, the royal governor of Flanders, and John I, Count of Aumale. In total, more than 1,000 nobles, men of title and lineage, were slaughtered where they stood. Never in medieval history had so much blue blood soaked into common soil. When the killing finally stopped, the Flemish walked among the wreckage, thousands of corpses scattered across the field, horses bloated, armor shattered, the stench of death thick in the summer air. They began to strip the dead. But it wasn't the armor or the weapons they prized most. It was the Golden Spurs. Each pair of spurs was a sacred symbol of knighthood, awarded when a squire became a full knight, proof of noble status. The Flemish cut them from corpses with their knives, the same knives they used in their workshops and slaughterhouses. By nightfall, they had collected over 700 pairs of golden spurs. Some hung them on belts as trophies. Others nailed them to workshop walls. But most were taken to the Church of Our Lady in Kortrijk, where they were hung together in a chandelier of humiliation, a glittering memorial to the day ordinary men destroyed the myth of knightly invincibility. The battlefield fell silent. As the last screams faded and the clang of iron gave way to the buzzing of flies, the Flemish realized what they had done. They had not just won a battle, they had rewritten history. Against all logic, a militia of weavers, butchers, and craftsmen had annihilated Europe's most powerful army. The myth of noble invincibility, 3 centuries old, had been shattered in a single afternoon. When the bodies were finally counted, even the victors couldn't believe the scale. Flemish records, later confirmed by church burial lists, estimated over 1,000 French knights dead, including some of the most powerful men in the kingdom. In total, more than 2,000 French soldiers perished that day. The Flemish losses? Barely 100. Many of those had fallen early in the fight, hit by the opening volley of crossbow bolts before the cavalry charge began. For every Flemish craftsman who died, 20 French nobles fell beside him. The bodies were so numerous they couldn't be buried properly. Most were dumped into mass graves, armor, spurs, and all, nobles and squires mixed together, stripped of all rank in death. Across France, mourning bells tolled in every province. Noble families wept for sons and husbands who'd left as conquerors and never returned. Some widows received back nothing but a blood-stained spur as proof their husband had died with honor. Others had no closure at all, their loved ones too mangled to be identified. For King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, the defeat was unthinkable. When the news reached Paris, he reportedly refused to believe it at first. How could merchants and blacksmiths destroy the flower of French chivalry? When the truth was confirmed, he flew into such a rage that courtiers feared for their lives. This wasn't just a military loss. It was an assault on the very foundation of medieval society, the belief that nobles were divinely chosen to fight and rule. The church struggled to explain it too. Priests debated how God could allow commoners to slaughter his appointed knights. Some said it was punishment for French pride. Others whispered that the devil himself had aided the Flemish. The French royal court tried desperately to control the story. Chroniclers were ordered to rewrite reports, claiming only a few hundred knights had died, a minor setback. But word of the massacre spread faster than censorship could contain it. And across Europe, people began to whisper a dangerous thought. If peasants can kill knights, maybe nobles aren't invincible after all. Back in Flanders, the victory became legend overnight. In Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres, the guilds held parades that lasted for days. Men who'd expected to die returned home wearing captured French cloaks and carrying knightly swords. Children ran through the streets waving broken lances like banners. Women sang songs about how the weavers of Ghent had crushed the flower of France. In taverns, craftsmen drank from helmets taken off dead French knights, toasting to the day the proud were brought low. The battlefield at Kortrijk became a pilgrimage site, a holy ground of common courage, where visitors came to see the spot where ordinary people had humbled kings. And in the Church of Our Lady, the chandelier of Golden Spurs glowed above the altar like a defiant symbol of freedom, 700 reminders that bloodline no longer guaranteed victory. King Philip IV couldn't let that symbol stand. For 2 years, he obsessed over revenge. He imposed crushing taxes across France to raise new armies, borrowed heavily from Italian bankers, and began planning a campaign to erase the humiliation of Kortrijk. The French learned from their mistake. When they returned to Flanders in 1304 and again in 1328, they brought more crossbowmen and infantry, avoided charging across unknown terrain, and fought more cautiously. They eventually won at the Battle of Kassel in 1328, where the Flemish were crushed in open ground. But the damage to French pride, and to the entire idea of noble superiority, could never be undone. Even when the French reclaimed Flanders, their knights never charged with the same arrogance again. The trauma of Kortrijk haunted them for generations. The Battle of the Golden Spurs didn't just change a war. It changed the way Europe thought about war. For the first time, professional aristocratic armies had been defeated by organized citizens. The lesson was clear. Discipline, planning, and unity could overpower wealth, titles, and bloodline. Across Europe, that message spread like wildfire. The Swiss adopted similar tactics against Austrian knights at Morgarten in 1315. The English refined them at Crécy and Agincourt a century later, where longbowmen would destroy French cavalry again and again. Even centuries later, when commoners and colonists took up arms in revolutions, historians would look back to Flanders, to that muddy field where the world first saw what ordinary people could do when they stood together. The Battle of the Golden Spurs didn't just end with victory, it ignited a cultural and political revolution. For centuries, knights had been seen as God's chosen warriors, men who fought while others worked or prayed. But that illusion died in the mud of Kortrijk. From that day forward, Europe began to realize that power could come not from birth, but from unity, organization, and courage. A new kind of power. The Flemish cities, Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres, had already been among Europe's richest trading hubs. Their cloth industry supplied half the continent. But until now, they'd lived under French control, forced to pay taxes to nobles who saw them as nothing more than cash cows. The victory at Kortrijk changed everything. The gold and weapons stripped from the French dead helped fuel a new wave of prosperity. Flemish merchants suddenly had leverage. They could negotiate with kings as equals, not subjects. They'd proven they could defend their cities without knights or castles. Only courage, discipline, and pikes. In that moment, the world caught its first glimpse of something entirely new. Citizen soldiers. Ordinary people who fought not for feudal obligation, but for freedom and survival. That idea would echo for centuries, through the Swiss Confederates, through the Dutch rebels, even through the American and French revolutions. The message was timeless. Ordinary people could stand against the powerful and win. The goedendag, the simple wooden club with a metal spike, became a symbol across Europe. Peasants in England, Germany, and Bohemia began crafting similar weapons, polearms, billhooks, flails, tools that could double as instruments of rebellion. They weren't elegant or noble. They didn't have names like Excalibur or Joyeuse. But they were democratic. Anyone could wield one. And that terrified the nobility. Rulers tried to ban them, calling such weapons unholy and dishonorable. But you can't outlaw a farming tool, not when the blacksmith and the farmer are the same person. The monopoly on violence, once held by kings and knights, had been broken. The psychological aftermath was just as powerful as the military one. French poets and chroniclers, who'd once written songs glorifying knightly valor, suddenly had to explain why their heroes were beaten to death by butchers and weavers. The church's traditional three estates, those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, no longer made sense. Because now those who worked could also fight and win. In Flanders, the victory became the foundation of national pride. Painters, playwrights and balladeers immortalized the common soldiers of Kortrijk as symbols of freedom and courage. For generations, Flemish children were taught that on July 11, 1304, their ancestors had humbled the mightiest army in Europe. That date, July 11th, is still celebrated today as Flemish Community Day, a public holiday in modern Belgium. King Philip IV would eventually claim vengeance. In later campaigns, the French returned with better tactics, defeating the Flemish at Kassel in 1328. But the damage to the Old World was done. From that point forward, the age of the aristocratic knight was in decline. Armor grew heavier, weapons deadlier, warhammers, halberds, and poleaxes designed to crush through plate. Knights were forced to fight on foot, losing the one advantage that had defined them for centuries. The arms race between armor and weaponry intensified, but the fundamental truth remained. No amount of steel could stop an organized, determined citizen army. Military historians today view Kortrijk as one of the first battles of the modern age of war. It showcased early combined arms, tactics, terrain modification, defensive positioning, infantry coordination, and psychological warfare, centuries before the term existed. The Flemish had transformed the battlefield into a trap, then used teamwork instead of individual heroics to win. It was a shift from feudal warfare, where battles were personal, to collective warfare, where organization and discipline triumphed over valor and rank. In a way, that muddy Flemish field marked the beginning of the end for the medieval world. And there's one part of the story that's often forgotten. The women of Flanders didn't just watch from the sidelines. Chroniclers record that they brought water and food to the front, dragged wounded men to safety, and, when the fighting turned savage, joined in. Some used stones, knives, or farm tools to finish off wounded French knights trapped in the mud. After the battle, they helped strip the dead, clean the weapons, and divide the spoils. In a world that gave them no titles and no rights, they still played a crucial role in one of the greatest upsets in history. Over the centuries, legends grew around the battle. Some tales claimed 1,000 pairs of spurs were taken instead of 700. Others told of lone weavers slaying dozens of knights single-handedly. But archaeology later confirmed the core truth. The French cavalry really had been destroyed by Flemish infantry. Unearthed armor fragments, broken lances, and horseshoes found in the ditch zones all matched the historical accounts. The legend, for once, didn't exaggerate reality. 80 years after the battle, the original Golden Spurs were finally removed from the church by Philip the Good of Burgundy. But it didn't matter. The Flemish replaced them with replicas, a reminder that symbols can be taken, but what they represent never dies. For generations, those spurs hung above the altar, gleaming in the candlelight, proof that power and pride can fall before the will of free people. Even during World War I, Belgian soldiers fighting German invaders drew strength from the story of Kortrijk. The legend lived on, not as a tale of revenge, but as a declaration of dignity. The Battle of the Golden Spurs wasn't just about peasants defeating knights. It was about an idea that courage and unity can overcome hierarchy and oppression, that even the smallest city, when its people stand together, can humble an empire, that real strength doesn't come from noble birth, but from conviction, and that on a muddy Flemish field in 1302, a group of ordinary men, armed with wooden clubs and a cause, struck the first blow against a world built on privilege. The day the Golden Spurs fell was the day the age of chivalry began to die.